Mean Old Lion Media presents Corner Table Talk.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Corner Table Talk. I'm your host, Brad Johnson. We are exploring subjects related to food plus drink plus culture. And today we are serving an extra helping of culture. As always, with questions or comments, you can reach me at brad@postandbeamhospitality.com. So we live in a time of information overload. This very podcast may be a challenge for you to find the time for. News comes at us from every direction at any hour of the day or night if we allow it. That can make it challenging to find the time for the things that are important to know. We all have to become ninjas at editing our time and our attention. The flood of nonstop news from the pandemic up and down cycle to Kanye West's latest lunch outing can take up headspace that is valuable. After all, there's only so much time in a day. Of course, the danger in this age of nonstop information is that some of the voices we should hear, as well as some of the history we should know, gets drowned out in the echo chamber of algorithms. My guest today is Dr. Julius Garvey, the surviving son of the Honorable Marcus Garvey, an activist, journalist, Amy Jacques Garvey. I open with the mention of our attention and what we focus on, in part because as I was researching Dr. Garvey, listening to his interviews, I gained a deeper understanding for the philosophy he speaks of, inspired by his dad. I began to process the journey of Black people in a broader context. As informed as I try to be, had my colleague and dear friend, Sister Ambassador Shabazz, not brought Dr. Garvey to my attention, the pathways, and speaking of my own here, the pathways clogged by too much information may have prevented me from paying closer attention to his clear voice. His is a worldview with roots as old as civilization, and the belief that the current world order is out of balance. He was born in Jamaica in 1933. Dr. Garvey is a highly accomplished surgeon, both nationally and internationally. Recognized for his contributions to medicine, he speaks, teaches, and presents clinical research at conferences across the country. His long list of accomplishments, appointments, associations, and affiliations with various hospitals are too numerous to list here. However, I will mention one. He began his first residency in surgery at the Mount Sinai Hospital of New York City, and that's where I was born. So on that connecting point, Dr. Garvey, welcome to Corner Table Talk.
Thank you for having me. But I did not deliver you, so don't blame me.
No, I checked the dates, and that would not have been possible. But but at least we have that in common. So, Dr. Garvey, I want to start with thanking Ambassador Shabazz again for bringing you to my attention in terms of the possible guest here and making today possible. So, Ambassador, thank you, and also offer to you my condolences. I know that you lost your brother, your older brother, Marcus Garvey Jr. in 2020. So, my condolences to you, sir.
Thank you so much for that. And, Ambassador Shabazz is a dear friend. We have a lot in common in that we're children of famous people who paid the price, shall we say, for their standing up to the system. So we share a lot, and we've been together on many an occasion. We've visited Grenada, etc. So I'm very pleased that she brought you to my attention and me to your attention.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, and on that note, I know sadly you also lost your dad at a very young age, and I think a very close age to when Ambassador lost her father. So we'll come back to that. So we kick things off on a light note here. I call them our short order questions. So let me shoot a few of those towards you and get your response. So, Dr. Garvey, what music are you listening to these days? Do you have any favorite artists that you go to often?
John Coltrane, I love Supreme, over and over and over again. John Coltrane is my favorite because he was always searching for truth, and searching for an understanding of life. So I feel a close affinity to his music.
Yeah, as long as A Love Supreme is, you only have to play that a couple of times to take up the whole day, right? But it's a brilliant recording, I agree. What are you reading?
I read a host of things. I read several books at one time, meaning that I read history. I read some biography. I read, shall we say, in the sciences, largely in terms of the physical sciences, the quantum physics type areas, how they apply to life. I read spiritual literature, Buddhist literature. So I'm a little bit of an omnivore where it comes to reading. That's what I do most of the time. By the way, I am retired. I'm no longer a practicing cardiothoracic and vascular surgeon. I've been retired for about 3 years. So I read, extensively throughout the day, etc.
A little bit more time for the reading, I would
I'm
imagine.
enjoying it.
Good for you. Well earned. Tell me, what's your morning routine?
Well, basically waking up and then having a meditation experience, shall we say. I meditate every day, and I usually start the day with that, and in some sense end the day with that, because I do believe that we are spiritual beings, having a physical experience, shall we say, and then the mind is the go-between between the spirit and the physical aspect. My meditation is what centers me, and I try to carry that throughout the day, the peace, the calm, the equanimity that you derive from getting in touch with yourself, which is really what meditation is. It might start out analytically, but you're really searching to find yourself. So it's about self-knowledge, and, I've been at it for a long time, so I feel as if I know myself to a significant degree, and that is makes me happy, because I think that's part of the purpose of life. You're here and you have a journey, and you have to know yourself, and then you have to manifest that self in terms of your activities. I try to carry that meditation throughout the day, so you end up with a meditation that's a non-meditation, if you will. So it becomes a way of life.
But a quieting of the mind, right, and allowing that space for that peace. I'm a struggling meditator. It's difficult for me. I know the value of it, but I definitely give it a shot every day.
As you mentioned earlier, there's so much out there. Most of it is nonsense, and most of it is trying to take you out of yourself, because that's the culture in which we live. It's a culture of things, and it's a culture of sensations, and taking you out of yourself and having you involved with the physical sensations of life, and how the intellect copes with that. So one needs the balance of the interior space.
And the disconnect from wanting, right? Exactly. Because that leads to suffering.
Exactly right. You sound very much like a Buddhist yourself.
So tell me, I know you're spending a lot of time in New York City. Is there a favorite place you like to go out to eat, or any good Jamaican food that you can recommend?
I haven't really eaten a lot of Jamaican food recently. Of course, in the lockdown, we've been locked down for about 2 years per se. But I live on the north shore of Long Island, in a little place called Seacliff. And, there are umpteen restaurants, everybody eats out, nobody cooks, sort of thing. A lot of my friends, they eat out 5 nights a week, or, 7 nights a week, if you will. So there are umpteen good restaurants. But, I tend to be a little bit vegan in that sense, and I tend to move towards seafood. I've moved away from meat. Basically shrimp, fish, lobster, that kind of thing, and mostly vegan. So I'm not. When I go to Jamaica, I do get into the jerk pork and so on, and the curry goat, just for reminiscing purposes. But it's not a diet at this point in time.
Yeah, no, understood. Your favorite view, if you're looking out at something, what would you most like to see?
Where I sit, we have an upstairs, and where I sit and read, etc. We have beautiful sunsets. I can see the sun going down. I have a water view of the Long Island Sound. So if it's the water view and the sunset, and every evening, right now it's about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. When the sun is going down, the colors are absolutely beautiful. But of course, in Jamaica, it's a different thing. It's more sand and sea. But I like those views because I grew up in a country, obviously Jamaica, where nature was everywhere. Even though obviously we had big cities per se, but not big in comparison to New York. But there were always trees. There was always grass. There was always flowers, and so nature was ever present. That's what I'm really trying to say. So I'm very, very comfortable in nature. Unfortunately, we have a garden and so on and so forth. So that's my delight. I look out of the upstairs window where I sit and I see, obviously in the winter, you don't see much in terms of garden, but you see the trees and then you have the water view and then the sunsets.
Love that, man. That late afternoon sunset is one of my favorite times today. I just love it. So if you were to host an intimate dinner party and you could invite anyone past or present, who might you have at that table?
Well, obviously the first person that comes to mind, since he's just recently passed, would be Sidney Poitier. I mean, he was so much of a hero to me in terms of going to the movies, which we all used to do, growing up. And of course, many of us in my time, we grew up with the cowboys and Indians, and we identified with the cowboys, and we thought the Indians were the bad guys. And then we got into the Stephen Fetchits and so on, and Eddie Rochester, and the clowning black types that were present coming out of Hollywood. So to see Sidney Poitier in roles that depicted, black people as human beings with an identity of their own and a personality of their own was simply marvelous. I mean, he had a dignity that corresponded, shall we say, I think, to my dignity coming out of the Caribbean, because, we didn't kneel, and, we fought our way to freedom. And we always had that strength of purpose in terms of who we are. And maybe that's part also of my growing up in the Garvey household. But that slap in the heat of the night, I mean, that reverberated in my mind over and over and over and over again, to see him slap a white man back who slapped him.
Was Mr. Colbert ever in this greenhouse, say last night about midnight?
Gillespie?
Yeah.
You saw it.
I saw it.
Well, what are you going to do about it?
I don't know.
I'll remember that.
Because that's always my ethos. If you mess with me, I'll mess with you, and I'm not backing up and so on. So I definitely would have Sidney Poitier at the head of the table. And next to him, of course, would be Harry Belafonte, and next to him would be Martin Luther King, and we can kind of go on in that type of role. But, those are my heroes. Next to that would be Malcolm X, Kwame Nkrumah, the strong black men who have stood up for us as a race, as a people, as a Pan-African nation. Those are my heroes. And of course, my dad would be there, my mom would be there, etc.
Wonderful. All right, so let's jump in here. I'd like to check in first. How are you? You look fantastic. How are you doing?
I'm very well. I'm very rested. Like I said, I've retired now for about 3 years. And, I get up when I want, and I don't wake up anymore in the middle of the night with, somebody bleeding or having a problem in the hospital that I have to go into. And, I'm not working late at night. As a matter of fact, I tell people, don't call me after 7 o'clock, I'm into my own thing. I'm eating and I'm relaxing there. Call me during the day, but don't call me too early. So I've enjoyed the lockdown. Like I said, it has corresponded pretty much with my retirement, which was fortunate for me. I didn't have to go through the lockdown while I was still practicing, because that would have been, quite stressful. So I'm enjoying it. I mentioned that I'm reading a lot. I'm also resting a lot. I go to bed when I want, and then I wake up when I want. Very often it's 9 o'clock or sometimes even 10 o'clock. But I do get at least 8 hours rest, and I'm not stressed again because of my meditation. So I'm restful. I'm not stressed, and I eat well. Maybe I fall down a little bit. I'm not into much of exercise at this point in time, but I've done a lot in the past, so my body is in reasonable shape. We have a pool, so I swim in the summer. Unfortunately, I'm not in Florida where I'd be able to swim all year round. As a good Jamaican, we love to swim. and go to the beach every day and so on and so on and so forth. So I feel fine. That's the short answer.
So your specialty was cardiothoracic and vascular surgery. I recently lost a dear friend, a childhood friend, same age as me, to sudden heart attack, and his family had a history of heart. His dad had cardiac arrest. His younger brother had also unfortunately passed a few years earlier. I went out to his house to take care of his affairs, and on his nightstand was a book called How Not to Die. And it just, oh man. But knowing what you do about the heart, and I know we've got limited time here, but what do you do that takes care of your heart with the knowledge that you have about how important it is to do that?
Well, we've kind of mentioned some of those things. The first thing is not to be stressed, because when you're stressed, it releases any number of hormones that do certain things to your metabolism. Certainly the adrenaline, noradrenaline. It's like you're always on the fight or flight. So your body is always reacting to stressful situations. Your heart is beating faster, your pulse rate is up, and these hormones are flooding your system. So this is an emergency. So instead of you being calm, you're always in a state of emergency. So that wreaks havoc on your body. So it puts it into a negative state of metabolism. Everything in your body, so to speak, is going into this fight or flight response. So, the blood is traveling, to your muscles and so on, away from your brain. Your veins are constricted in certain areas. That means your blood vessels are constricted in certain areas and so on. Certain of your essential organs are cut off from your normal blood supply and oxygenation. So when that occurs over a long period of time, then there's a physical response or negativity, so to speak, because but your brain and other parts of your body that you need are not getting the amount of blood, that they require, because it's all going to your musculoskeletal system or the other emergency response systems. So stress. One needs to de-stress or not have stress, shall we say. So stress is very, very, very important in terms of causing heart attacks and other types of chronic illnesses, strokes, etc., high blood pressure, and so on. The other thing, of course, is diet, which we have talked about. 70 to 80% of the diseases that we have at the present time are lifestyle diseases. The diabetes, the hypertension, the strokes, the cardiovascular, all of that. 60% of the population is obese. That has negative effects in terms of health. And as you've seen with the pandemic, those who have had the highest mortality are those with the pre-existing risk factors, which are the things that I just talked about, such as obesity, such as a poor diet, eating, largely animal diet. And, a lot of processed foods, because the way in which foods are processed, they have a lot of chemicals and strange things in them to give them shelf life that's longer than your own lifespan. So some of these foods there, they can stay on the shelf for 50, 60, 70 years without changing. So that's no good for you. So if we were to have a plant-based diet, to a large extent plant-based diet, we would get rid of 70 to 80% of the diseases that we have at the present time. So that's where I am in terms of my own diet, and that's what I would recommend for everybody, is to de-stress. I do it, of course, with meditation. We've talked about that. Get adequate rest, diet, and of course exercise. And good forms of exercise are, walking, bike riding. I don't care for jogging that much, because I do believe over time it affects your joints, because we're not really supposed to be doing that in terms of that. And it's all about conforming to nature in terms of how we were made to be running constantly, especially not on asphalt or concrete, where a lot of people run on the roads and so on and so forth, because the pounding affects your joints, the cartilage in the joints, and so on and so forth. So exercises, such as swimming, stretching, walking, and so on and so forth. So again, de-stress, plant-based diet, exercise. That's pretty much it.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that's a fantastic summary, and coming from you, it has a great deal of credibility. So I hope our audience takes note. I'm certainly taking note of your advice there. So I'm curious where you get your news. We've gone through in the last 24 months, say, given the pandemic and the election and all that went on. We've seen a lot, and the number of hate groups I read recently quadrupled since Barack Obama was in office. The election was the largest turnout in history, yet it was, completely divided. What do you think is going on here, Dr. Garvey? What are we seeing?
Well, I think you are seeing that the division coming to the fore. America has never faced its original sin as a problem. It has always tried to avoid it, even though there was a civil war relative to slavery, but there was no real reconstruction. As you know, there was no 40 acres and a mule. There was no restitution for 250 years of labor, of free labor and punishment and all the injustice. Now we are beginning to talk about reparations, and now I think with social media, etc., a lot is coming to the fore in terms of the understanding of people. There's more understanding of the horrors of slavery. There's more understanding of, what was done in World War II, or what happened in the Korean War, or, what happened in Iraq, what has happened in Afghanistan. So, the system itself is being seen to be, not as wonderful as it's made out to be. So there's a certain amount of desire, I think, again, to want to change the system. And if you look, you'll see that this is cyclical, I think. If you go all the way back to my dad's time, the First World War in 1914-18, he came to this country, U.S. in 1916. There were all of these changes in terms of African Americans moving from the south to the north, occupying the margins of the Industrial Revolution, shall we say, and going abroad and fighting on the side of the Allies, if you will, the U.S., fighting for democracy, where they had been subjected to slavery and the sharecropping and the cotton industry and so on and so forth in the South. So that created a scenario for change. And that's when the Garvey movement, or the United ACL, came to the fore, because it was solving the problems at that time of the African American or the African worldwide. And then you fast forward, another 30 or so years with another generation, again, coming in after World War II. And you get up to the 60s. So you have the 20s, 30s, and then you get the generation going up to the 60s. And then you have the civil rights, and you have Malcolm X, and you have Martin Luther King, leading that same desire for justice and the changes that were wrought with World War II. Again, so many Africans, both African Americans, Africans from Africa and the Caribbean, fighting on the side of the Allies, being exposed to these different changes, again, fighting for democracy, coming back and bringing this back, generating this desire for change. And then you go to the 90s again, with the same sort of thing was happening with another generation. Now we're in the 20s, and the same thing is happening, Black Lives Matter, etc. So you have these opposing forces, the forces over time that have enslaved us, have colonized us, have dehumanized us, that have become systemic in terms of the laws that have been propagated against us, but that preventing us from equity in terms of being full citizens here in the United States of America, the injustice, our incarceration rate, and you can go on and on with that, as opposed to those forces that want, true freedom, true equity, and true justice, social justice and equity in terms of a full share of the citizenship of the country. So that is now rubbing against each other again. And that's why you had January the 6th. That's why you're having what you just described. And on our side, shall we say, we're talking about Black Lives Matter and all that means. And I think you'll find that Garveyism, again, is sort of on the rise in terms of it being an expression of who we are as an African people, our desire for liberty and a true democracy and sustainable development over time and prosperity. So I think this is simply a cycle that comes every 1 or 2 generations, whereby liberty is fighting against incarceration and dehumanization, shall we say.
One of the things that occurred to me as I researched your dad and listened to some of your lectures was this idea that, as Black Americans, I think, and I'm speaking very generally here, that we tend to define ourselves by slavery, right? And what I got from your Afrocentric worldview was a much broader vision of, certainly if you go back to the beginning of time and you talk about what cultures were around at the beginning of time, African culture was there at the beginning. And to see and think of ourselves in that context, in a world vision, I think while slavery is important to recognize, of course, and we still haven't dealt with that, I think the broad vision is important, that you don't define yourself by that period of time. Would you concur? Am I on to your thinking there?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Because what slavery did was that it disconnected us from ourselves in terms of our identity and our culture, and destroyed our history or perverted the telling of our history and our story, as if to say our enslavement was something beneficial to us, which is turning everything upside down. Because the truth of history basically is that world history is African history, because humanity began in Africa. I think every anthropologist or archaeologist or whatever in the world, agrees to that. The images that have been created of what Homo sapiens would have looked like, 200,000 years ago, is obviously as an African person like me and like you. And this is accepted now by everybody in terms of a scientific truth. So that we are the original Homo sapiens. We are the fathers and mothers of all the other so-called races on planet Earth. And being that is so, we did not migrate out of Africa until about 40,000 years ago. All human beings were on the continent of Africa for, 100,000 years or so, and we migrated outward and we populated the world. So we populated the world, and then there was differentiation in terms of, because of geography and because of climate over time, there was different phenotypical manifestations of what it means to be human. And along with that, again, because of geography, what the environment allowed you to do, there is also different cultural manifestations over time. But we're all one human set of human beings. We're all one race. And this is what we understand. And this is what, has been clouded over, shall we say, with the propaganda that somehow we're subhuman. And the other aspect of that is obviously we are the purveyors of civilization, because civilization started in Africa, and they've tried their best to turn Kemet into some kind of civilization that came from white people when there were no white people in Africa at that point in time. And the original civilization, like, for example, Kemet itself, has an oral history that goes back 40,000 years in terms of who we are as a people, coming before written history. The written history goes back about 4,000 years, 4,000 BC. So that is our history in terms of Kemet, in terms of Kush, in terms of Punt, in terms of what is modern day Sudan, or what is modern day Ethiopia. Those are all our civilizations over time, before there was any such thing as Europe. Europe was in the Ice Age, before there was anything such as Greece or Rome. Those people came to Africa to learn, all of them, Pythagoras and Plato and Socrates and so on. All of those white young people came to Africa to learn. That's our history, the original people, the original civilizations. And that has been destroyed and distorted over time as an excuse for slavery, which was, an economic adventure and an economic expression of doctrines of white supremacy. Again, we civilized the Greeks, we civilized the Romans, and then later on, as part of the Moors, let's say from the 7th century onwards, we again civilized Europe with the Arabs until 1492. When the Moors were kicked out of Europe. So our history is long and deep and profound, and it's really world history because it existed before anybody else's history. So when you're talking about history, you have to start with African history, and then you have to see what deviated from African history.
And I want to come back to that in a moment because we've heard a lot lately about the term critical race theory, and it's been politically weaponized, as a term when we're really talking about history. We call it critical race, but it's history, what really happened. But I want to come back to that because there's a quote of yours that I want to read from in a few minutes and I'll bring Ambassador Shabazz in on that part of the discussion. But before we get to that, there's another quote I have of you speaking in 2019. And you say, quote, even though people of color have achieved more political and social autonomy, we're still deprived of equal economic opportunities in terms of being able to develop our own communities. Blacks are still at the bottom of the ladder, so to speak, in the U.S. hierarchy, as well as in the social and economic order. The economic order actually should be placed first as it determines one's social order in the U.S., a country that professes to be an economic democracy, end quote. So if the economic order should actually be placed first, and Black people, assuming that Black people would then move up the economic ladder, what mechanism would you say we have available to us to accomplish that? Is that reparations? What are you thinking?
Again, if you go back to my dad and in the 20s and early on the late teens, you could see exactly the model. And this was what scared a lot of people. They had the Negro Factories Corporation, the African Communities League as the economic arm of the organization, Universal Negro Improvement Association. And, they had umpteen businesses in Harlem, all the way from, laundromats, grocery stores, restaurants, moving companies, real estate, publishing companies,
newspaper, doll shop.
1933, 75,000 contributors and so on and so forth, employing more than 1,000 people in Harlem. And this was out of our own economy in terms of employing ourselves. And then you look at some of the major projects, which would be, let's say, the Black Star Line, which was, how should I say, I'm not the right term there, but, that they had shares out there, which they sold for $5 a share. They got $1 million within a year to buy the ships that they ended up buying, which was ended up as 4 ships. So there is, funds within the Black community to do what we want to do, or what we determine to do. People like to tell you that the Black American economy is $1 trillion economy or something like that. Now, granted, a lot of that is salary, but a lot of it, that what we do with that is waste our money on bling and so many other unnecessary things. So if we were to put our money into constructive efforts like what Marcus Garvey did at that point in time for community, and don't forget, those were all social enterprises, the Black Star Line, etc. Those were all social enterprises whereby the community would buy the shares and then, of course, reap the profit, and the profits were then put back into the business and to do what was necessary for the community. In other words, they had credit unions and they had kind of welfare programs and whatever else was needed in terms of education for a university and so on and so forth. So we can generate our own communities out of, our resources, both our financial resources, our physical resources, and our mental resources. And that goes back to Tuskegee. We need to learn the mechanics of the industrial and post-industrial age. And that was what was being taught. And that's what my dad read Up From Slavery, Booker T. Washington. And that's what he wanted to duplicate in Jamaica and so on. And in some sense, that's what he duplicated. But with the caveat that it wasn't just a matter of individual capitalism, but it was social enterprises. Because if you had a bunch of rich individuals, which is what has happened, we have a bunch of black rich individuals in their different areas, whether it's in sports or the arts or in other enterprises, but the community is not developing out of that wealth, because that wealth is being spent elsewhere. So here's the difference from Booker T in that sense, was that these needed to be community enterprises so that the profits and the benefits then would go to the community. So this was the beginning of social entrepreneurship. Other people also have it, but Marcus Garvey did this 100 years ago.
Yeah, we've talked about this often on this show, because we are, I come out of the restaurant industry and second generation. My dad had a place in Manhattan. He opened in 1973. And I've written about how I use the example of a prominent, say, a LeBron James, who might spend his money at Nobu, a very, fancy sushi restaurant, at the expense of overlooking the local Black-owned restaurant in the neighborhood. And that guy suffers while, the Carmelo Anthony's drop, $5,000 at the steakhouse in Miami drinking expensive wine. The guy, over in Overtown with the place that's been there for a long time doesn't see that kind of revenue. And it's hurtful. And I think that desegregation, while certainly a worthy effort in the civil rights movement, desegregation destabilized Black neighborhoods and Black businesses.
I wouldn't say so much it was desegregation, but it was the desire for integration, meaning essentially assimilation. This was one of the problems, and my father said this in terms of liberating your mind from mental slavery, because while others may help you free the body, none but yourself can free the mind. And Frantz Fanon called that, black skin, white mask, where you're disconnected from yourself and you want to be with the one who has oppressed you. It's a reaction. I was going to say it's a natural reaction, but in some sense it is a natural reaction. The person who enslaved you and deprived you for everything, and you see him having everything, and you say, I want what he has. So when the enslavement period is over, that's where you gravitate, because he has got the goodies and you want to share those goodies. So that was what came out of the desegregation movement, the desire to want to sit at the table, with the previous enslaver or colonizer. Now, what my dad brought to the table was independence. Now, see, some people call it separation, but that's when you allow people to play with your minds in terms of how they define the situation. And, they define it in the way in which they want to define it. But if you define it from the perspective of your validity as a human being over time, with your culture and your history, you want your own freedom and you want to be able to define your own destiny. You don't necessarily want to go and sit at somebody else's table, and eat their food. You want to be able to plant your food, cook your food and eat your food at your table. That's independence. You see, that's not separation, that's independence. And, you don't care necessarily who is next door, but you want your own table with your own food and with your own family that you're comfortable with. You see, but a lot of people describe that, as separation. It has nothing to do with separation. It's just about manifesting who you are in the different, areas of daily living. And there's no reason why you should be like this other person and like their culture, because their culture is not definitive of human culture. We can have another discussion about that. A true understanding of who and what humanity is. I maintain that African humanism is the essence of what humanity is, whereas in terms of the Euro-centric a definition, it really has to do with scientific materialism, where they've deviated from the norm of what a human is, and we're really being treated like human animals, catering to our senses and using the intelligence to scheme relative to our sensory comfort or relative to the individual accumulation of wealth at the expense of others, and so on and so forth. We can go through sociology and political sociology and philosophy, but there's a difference in terms of, what over time we have considered to be the norm. And I say we as African people, in terms of our cultures and our traditions.
Brilliant. And I'm gonna bring Ambassador Shabazz in at this point in the conversation. And Dr. Garvey, what your father, the two of the most prominent things that I saw that he stood for was, one, self-reliance, and two, he believed that disunity was the greatest threat to the Negro, is the term that he used at the time. And I wanted to read, because you just touched on that famous quote that we all know from the Bob Marley song, but that is actually your dad's quote. And I'm going to read something that you said on Afro Global Television in 2020, and then get it, some of what you've already touched on. But I just think it encompasses so much. And then I'd like to turn it back over to the two of you, and as we dive a little bit deeper into this part of the show. So you said, quote, "History has been rewritten so that we have been written out of history, and our understanding of ourselves has been transformed. We've been miseducated by the people that conquered us and put their own systems in place so that we no longer have the systems that allow us to grow up true to our traditions and ourselves. This is what is still keeping us down. My father called it mental slavery. None but ourselves can free the mind. We have a dependency syndrome, European dominance, and our inferiority. We need a personal transformation, a transformation of consciousness. We have to liberate our minds, knowing who we are, knowing who we were, knowing what we can be. We have to liberate our minds. It's needed for us. It's needed for the whole world, because the world is lopsided with the idea that the European perspective is a global perspective. It is not a global perspective. It's simply a European perspective, and it's very selfish, very one-sided. It seeks to enrich Europeans at the expense of the rest of the world. And obviously, that's a recipe for continued conflict, whereas the world needs balance and the world needs love." End quote. So that sounds like pretty critical theory to me. Two of you, what unpack that in any way that you see fit?
Well, I think the statement more or less stands for itself. Obviously, we can do a deeper dive. We can go back to what we talked about earlier on, the extent of civilization on the African continent, and that is based on African humanism, which you can identify in the concept of Ma'at when you go back to Kemet, and you can identify, as Ubuntu in the Bantu civilizations and so on. When you can look at the Songhai and you can look at the Yoruba and you can look at the Akan, and they all have the Dogon. They all have this humanism as part of their cultural expression. This is our essence, but what has happened is that the West has gone away from that, and the West I'm talking about is Europe, meaning that their definition of God was external to man, and so when that didn't satisfy them in terms of their understanding of the world, they threw that out and went wholeheartedly into scientific materialism, because that gave them an understanding of their surroundings and things. And that was also their understanding of themselves, so that their spirituality was also thrown out, because it was indeed initially externalized in that God was someone out there who had created everything, and he was up there somewhere, but he was not immanent, he was transcendent. Whereas if you look at the African system, our God is both immanent and transcendent. He didn't create us and walk away. He created us, he's with us, he transforms, changes us, he transforms us, and it's a cyclical situation of continuous creativity. And we are in harmony with that, and that's what Ma'at means, and so on, and Ubuntu, because I am because you are, and you are because I am, and that's how we are. We are all part of this oneness. So our understanding of our humanity is a oneness with each other and a oneness with nature, whereas the European understanding is very dualistic in terms of self and other, and it's schizophrenic, and it's always two minds, or this mind that I and you, or me and you versus you. or self versus other. And that's the basis of everything. There's individualism, and then there's competition for whatever the resources are out there. And, we have certain values, but then again, those values can be put aside in dire moments when we need to get whatever it is that we need to get. So that's how you can go out there and kill other human beings like yourself, because your ideology is basically individualistic, as opposed to being humanistic, and as opposed to being universalist. So, there's a tremendous difference between, African understanding and the European understanding. And I think they've gone in a different direction, and they're now in a cubbyhole where they can't get out of it. And that's why you have all of the nonsense that we have in terms of the use and abuse of drugs. You have all of this lack of identity in terms of male and female. You have pornography, everything, pederasty, so on and so forth. So, and there are no values anymore, no morals anymore. You can do whatever you want to do. Well, that's not true. If you look all around you at nature, I mean, you can't plant an oak seed and get a rose. Oak seed has to give you an oak tree. And a human being is a human being. I mean, it's defined by nature, but we define it ourselves, and I think that we're smarter than nature. When I say we, know, I'm talking about the Euro-centric perspective, because we're surrounded by it, unfortunately at the present time, and it has to change because it's going nowhere. It's destroying the planet, and it's destroying, so many species, both plant, animal species, human beings, etc. So, there's a high kill rate out there, and at some point in time, it's just going to go all the way, down, and we'll leave it over to the cockroaches and the viruses and so on and so forth.
Well, I mean, I'm just digesting everything that has been discussed thus far, and I'm thinking of the synergy and the origin that is so familiar for me. And I wonder how much of it is the innate in terms of the gene pool, and I meant the historic gene pool, back to the source of the root of Africa gene pool, that far back, and or the practices that I am born of directly. When Dr. Garvey and I get to speak, I really feel an automatic synergy. And my father didn't get to be in my life long, but somehow or another, whatever that seed was, whatever that nature was, the aunts and uncles in and around who were influenced by their parents, who were stewards in the Marcus Garvey movement, I listen to him and I know myself. I hear myself. I know my origins. So even the conversations about meditation, one doesn't talk about that in general population, especially when it comes to Black America. We have to wait till Sunday to pray, as opposed to being part of the metaphysical all day. The universalism, the oneness is a part of who you are all day. And that the context of spirituality is often relegated to a mortal host rather than that which we are inherently a part of, an extension all the while. So just thank you, Dr. Garvey, for the articulation that unites spirituality, intellect, and purpose. And that you can actually, if you pause for a while, marry them all, engage them all, and identify that which we are relegated to do or born to do all day. So one of the things that I wondered during 2020, it was new for a new generation. We're 3 generations since the civil rights movement. And so there was a bit of a disconnect. But what was understood inherently by young people in the street is that this cannot be. They put everything on the line. They put catching COVID on the line by being in the street. Some did not go to school that fall. They didn't resume because they were insistent on one thing or the other. In their body's marrow, while the outcry was Black Lives Matter, what I knew is that they never knew who Marcus Garvey was, and that they didn't have to start from scratch, that they could actually have reached back and had a guideline, a template, an understanding of fulfilled efforts, because I'm here generations later as an influenced person by the Garvey clarities, informed. So what language would you use today so that you, speaking to your grandson, who is 23, and his peers, would you link Black Lives Matter so that they understand the Universal Negro Improvement Association and that they don't have to start from scratch, that here are the tenets? What was the membership? How many people don't even realize how many members there were, how many enterprises there were. We don't realize our numbers.
Quite true. I don't know that I have the language to speak to the younger generation, because the younger generation at this point in time they're wedded to their apps and so on, and their cell phones, and they have short attention spans, and what they listen to or what they watch has to be put in a certain way that they digest it. So I don't know that I have that capacity to reach them, but I do believe that truth and justice will out, and everybody ends up seeking truth. And that's what is important is to be able to speak the truth, because people also recognize sincerity. So if you've been there, then you can talk about where you've been, and someone will listen. And I think those who listen will have reached a certain critical point in their own lives where they're asking questions and they're not getting their answers from their cell phones or their devices, and with all the Disney type artifacts on the cell phone. So I think that is the environment that has to be created. And and from my perspective, I don't think it has been created. I think we need to create that, and I know that's part of what you're doing, Ambassador Shabazz, and we need to be able to work on that, to create these spaces where young people can get to interact with my generation or the generation after me, so to speak, because I'm separated by about 2 or 3 generations from the young people. But we need that environment, which goes beyond the concept, as which is very prevalent in terms of our Western environment, that old people don't matter, so to speak. Once you're over 30, you've kind of had it, especially if you can't manipulate the IT. Then they say, oh, it's a fuddy-duddy or whatever it is, and that's what's spread around the world. But you and I come from a tradition where the elders carry the wisdom. The young people don't necessarily know that. So we have to create that sort of environment, because it's a matter of experience. It's a matter of living through all of this. It's a matter of knowing things, digesting them,
That's
throwing
true.
out what didn't suit you, and so on and so forth. And this is what needs to be passed down, so each generation doesn't start from scratch, trying to figure out the situation that they're living in, when the situation that they're living in is really a replica of the situation from 500 years ago or even 1,000 years ago. So they need to understand that. So, almost at birth, so to speak, they have the wisdom to be able to deal with the environment. They're not starting from scratch and making the mistakes and trusting those that they shouldn't trust, and trying to imitate those again that they shouldn't imitate.
I have a question. So there are 2 books I want to ask for the audience and for young people. One, the book that you would say best prepares us to understand your father and his intention. And 2, who else should we read or know? What would be, when you say you enjoy reading, what would take people down the path, young people, mature people, into really understanding?
Rupert Lewis has been the major historian writing about, my dad, and he has several books. Apart from Rupert, Adam Ewing has a great book, The Age of Garvey. So many people, because of their poor education, even though they have PhDs and so on and so forth, don't really understand the width and the depth of the Garvey movement. But Adam Ewing, who wrote this book a few years ago, The Age of Garvey, how a Jamaican activist created a mass movement and changed global Black politics. And I think this is of extreme importance in understanding Garveyism. Then, of course, in terms of the whole history of who we are as a people, I think one of the ones that is of significance, recent origin, is Born in Blackness. And you should read that one. And it's really changing the historical narrative from the Euro-centric perspective, that everything started with them. And so, and showing that how modern world history, etc., from 1471 to the Second World War, that Africans and Africa was central to the making of history during that period. And of course, we know different also previous to that, but it shows the centrality of Africa in history. So that's Born in Blackness by Howard French. To bring us up to date in terms of America, what has been happening here is the 1619 project, which Nicole Hannah-Jones.
So, Dr. Garvey, Ambassador, here we are. It's 2022. We're in an age where a Kim Kardashian has 300 million followers, and someone maybe whose voice we should hear a little bit more of is not anywhere near that level. Who would you say are the most important Black leaders in the world today, or even, in the United States? Would you put Kamala Harris on that list? Who is there that you are paying attention to that you think is worth mentioning in answer to this question?
So do you mean that in terms of position and post, or do you mean that in terms of influence?
Well, that's the line that I think gets a little blurry, right? Because now there's the term influencers, and right, Hollywood has always been able to put certain people. You mentioned Sidney Poitier. I mean, he's been a big influence. Obviously, he's never been a politician, but he had a big influence in his dignity, and certainly a big influence on folks. But I'm talking mainly here about someone that could impact politics in a way that can get some things done that we feel might not be happening now. But Dr. Garvey, I'm curious, who would be on that list for you? Who do you think is the brightest, best leader that we have?
I don't think there's anyone. I don't see anyone on the political scene that represents us in terms of being able to transform the system or speak up to the system or represent us properly. I don't see anyone. You mentioned Kamala Harris, but she hasn't had a chance. She's in the shadows of the president. And I think the way they have been using her is to her disadvantage. The way they're sending her to different places, to the border and so on, they're putting her in hot spots where all she's doing is drawing fire. So I don't. She's not in a position of demonstrating leadership. I think she has the possibility and characteristics based on her past history, her education, upbringing, and so on. But I don't believe the administration is using her properly. On the other hand, in terms of influencers, there are people like Maulana Karenga, Malefi Asante, Anthony Browder, and so on. Those are some of my idols, if you will, or people that I talk to. And who have a similar ideology, shall we say, to myself, Linda James Myers, and so on, and Joyce King in terms of African education. But that's, you might say, an inner circle of people who are like-minded and are making contributions in their own way.
Ambassador?
No, I would defer to Dr. Garvey on this because I too am looking for who that is and how it's represented. Sometimes it's a quiet force, and some need to be able to step up. I think the last 4 years really did make people shy based on the rise of violations and human threat. And so I come from a time when principle made people walk no matter the threat. So today I think it intimidates it and justifiably. Nobody wants to leave their family behind. My generation witnessed casualties of some of those acts, meaning families like mine or Dr. Garvey's would be without that person in our lives forever. So you have to ask whomever is going to step up, what are they willing to endure? What risks to their well-being? And that's a big ask. I think by now, for all of the leaders and examples that we've had in the past, that we shouldn't be starting from scratch and that we should use some of the templates of instruction and guidance that it already precedes. That's why I ask, do these young people even know? They don't know my father, and that's more recent, right? They kind of like use a slogan and think that that's emblematic of something. And with Dr. Garvey, whom I think is root significant in the Western Hemisphere for us to know that we shouldn't be starting from scratch. We need to go back and do some 101 on who Marcus Garvey is, and that he had a wife that was very significant in that balance, that there are children and grandchildren. And how many members, Dr. Garvey, would you say there were of the UNIA during your father's lifetime?
Between 6 and I've heard of up to about 15. Well, I would say between 6 and 10 million.
Can you imagine that membership, 6 million and upwards of Black people or those of African descent around the globe representing a union, a unity? We don't even know numbers like that. We don't even turn out to vote when we have the opportunity to vote. And coming from New York myself, I know that Harlem is filled with all of the social enterprises during the Renaissance period. We don't even know that. We think of the new Harlem as an invasion of people who don't look like Harlem without any regard to the fact that Harlem once carried all of the same esteem. And so I think there's some, maybe through what we continue to do through the exoneration process, that we don't stop on March 2nd, because there's a presidential pardon campaign now to honor the Honorable Marcus Garvey, so that and I'll have Dr. Garvey speak to it, but we shouldn't stop after the 100,000 signatures. We really need to continue. We don't put a lid on it. What does March look like? What does April look like? How does August around his birthday show up? What is the 365-day approach to learning who we are?
And you're speaking of justice for Garvey. So, Dr. Garvey, you're welcome to say a couple of words about that. We're winding down, but I want to get a few more questions in, but I certainly wanted to hear from you on the Justice for Garvey campaign.
Yes, we are organizing or have organized a drive for a petition to President Biden. We need 100,000 signatures on that petition during this month of February. The drive started on February the 1st, and people can go to the website, justiceforgarvey.org, justice, the number 4, Garvey.org, and they can hit on the link for the petition. It's there, and then they'll get directions as to what to do to contact the president, and then they'll be asked some personal information like name and address, and they don't have to be a citizen, and they can be anywhere in the world, and any type of person, shall we say. And then it will request of them what is it that they want, what would they like to do, and they need to put down their exonerate Marcus Garvey. So it's a petition to President Biden to exonerate Marcus Garvey. And his response to that should be at least, a posthumous pardon, which is within his power to do with the simple stroke of a pen. So we need 100,000 signatures in the month of February. It started February the 1st, and 100,000 is the threshold. Above that, he has to respond one way or another, yea or nay. Below that, he doesn't have to respond. So it's very important that we get a minimum of 100,000 signatures. Justiceforgarvey.org.
And when you think about 6 million registered members in 1920, you think we can at least get 100,000 signatures in 2022.
And for those who don't know that are listening, that the conviction was based on at best a trumped up mail fraud charge that was pursued by J. Edgar Hoover when he first joined the FBI. And we all know his racist past. Actually got commuted by President Coolidge, but it required that your dad be deported to Jamaica. So we're not even really talking about a real crime here. So it just seems that enough is enough already. So folks out there, let's sign that petition. Dr. Garvey, before we let you go, a couple of, on a little bit more of a light note, but still, I think something that I'm curious to get your take on. Is Black History Month a worthy endeavor?
Well, I think it should be African Heritage Month, and then I think it should be year-round, not just a month. As you know, it started out with a week, and then it's a month now, and we need to teach our kids African history every day of the week and every month of the year. It's a year-round job for us as elders, as seniors, as people who create schools, who create systems, who create communities. And that's where we're losing it with our youngsters. We're losing their minds. Their minds are being shaped by somebody else. So then they cannot be like us or us in terms of our traditions because we're not teaching them. And we need to do that on a year-round basis, 24/7, 52 weeks of the year, etc. So I'm all for African Heritage Year. That's the next step.
Absolutely. African Heritage Month is how I refer to it, but African Heritage Year, it's how I walk. It's how I move.
That's how you roll. So, Dr. Garvey, as we close, I wanted to just read one of the quotes of your dad's that I really love, and just get you to comment on it, and we'll go out on this. But your father said, "Progress is the attraction that moves humanity." That just strikes me, and I mean that's hopeful and optimistic. What's your feeling about that?
I mean, another way to look at it is, build a better mousetrap, and everybody will come to you, and that's what he was all about. He was saying, don't waste time complaining or whatever it is, or pointing the finger. Build your own mousetrap, build your own community, build your own industries, build your own corporation, build your own nation. And if people don't want to come, that's their business, But if you build it, they will come, and if you build it, and he was also talking about excellence in terms of that. If you see, so it's not just progress in terms of something, but in terms of creativity of us as humans, and then also the excellence of what we create. And when we do that, then everybody has to respect you. They can't do better than that. So you do the best that you can with what you have, and nobody can do better than that.
Build a better mousetrap. I'll use that in the restaurant business too. The guy down the street has the better mousetrap. He's got more business. Dr. Julius Garvey, thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. Many more warm sunsets for you, and hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
So sliding into our segment, How We Move, with Ambassador Shabazz. And I know that I brought you in a little early in that conversation with Dr. Julius Garvey, but I really felt that it was appropriate. I know you have a long relationship there, and your alignment is pretty profound. But what a fantastic time I had talking to him. What a deep intellectual, great thinker.
Just amazing. I mean, thank you so much for seeing the value in him being on right now, as in one of the elders that are around us. And we don't even realize the stories that are chronicled and the roadmap, as I referenced, the stepping stones and the lesson plans that are right here ready for us to utilize, so that we are not always in a recovery mode. How do we advance forward, right? We don't have to stop and start all the time. And that's a kind of fatiguing for the elder. So sometimes they retreat because they're not really being heard. And when you speak to enough people from different parts of the United States and the Caribbean, notwithstanding Africa, of a certain age, they all will talk about how their parent or grandparent had Garvey's picture up on the mantle. Right. But it had to be quieted because of the innuendos and the associations and the positions that it put us in right here. If you want to keep your job, I mean, theologies, ideologies, methodologies always had to be tame so as to make sure you kept your jobs and things like that. And listening to him with you and the opportunity to exchange, and you asking questions that really delve into his life, his just journey as a human being, as a man, and him being able to share the spiritual component and not just the tagline that is often associated to his dad, or the weaponizing of his dad. But I think people do that in order to keep us, separate. And he always talked about unity.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to touch on the obvious through line, the DNA that we got to witness, and him having lost his dad as you did at such a young age. But when I look at the both of you, there's so much of the brilliance of both of your parents, who, brilliant in their own right. But you see that in each of you, even though only a very short period of your life was actually spent in their physical presence.
Well, and the continuity is also by the surviving parent. Right. So the balls weren't dropped. And in each of our cases, we knew our fathers not from the public persona. We had the potency of who they were at home, the whole man. And so I think that's also very key. Often people will present to me who they think my father is based on the caption, and or who Marcus Garvey was to his children. And you want to say, no, there's so much more dimension. So when you listen to someone like Dr. Garvey or meet his daughter, who's just as eloquent, just as traveled, just as thoughtful, has just as much conviction. The next generation, we don't know her face either. Most people don't know Dr. Garvey's face, but he is fully involved with the AU. That's 54 African countries. He goes there a lot. He shares. So why is it that we are still, divided here, trying to choose sides? In order to proclaim your Africanness does not mean you have to do it exclusive to anything else that you do. So holding on to that which is African is not radical. It's an existence. It's part of your yes. So why do we forfeit our yes in order to acquiesce and be a part of something that isn't who you are? I don't know what that is. And that it doesn't exclude or preclude multiple engagement. But it's an interesting lesson. And then when I'm around Dr. Garvey, I have an exhale because I know the being. I mean, when we first met, I actually collapsed on him. I'm a little taller, and I collapsed on him. I just cried. I couldn't even find the words, just because of how much. My grandfather was a chapter president of the UNIA in each of their cities, and they were burnt out and run out, just like the stories we're learning. And my father was the fourth born in Omaha, but the family didn't live in Omaha long because they were also torched out of there. And so we talk about people who really stood for something against the odds. And my grandmother was a continuity, like Jacques Garvey was a continuity, like your mom was a continuity. I mean, we really, as human beings, come from such foundational value, but we're distracted by the noise and the distractions that you referenced in the early part of the interview. There's just so much coming at us that you don't realize that most of us actually have a gift in our presence, and it might be under your roof.
Well, I want to thank you again. It's obvious the warmth that he felt and feels towards you, and that's what brought him to the Corner Table Talk show today. So I want to thank you for that. And it really was a pleasure and an honor to spend time with him, and you, of course, as always.
Well, thank you. It was wonderful to watch the two of you, my brother.
Ambassador Shabazz.
Corner Table Talk is hosted by Brad Johnson, produced by Brad and Linda Ailes Johnson. Theme music, Life Goes On by Bryce Vine. Executive producer, Ken Johnson. Find the Corner Table Talk podcast wherever you get your podcast. Follow, subscribe, rate, and leave a comment. Corner Table Talk is a Mean Old Lion Media production.